The most important thing to know about The Power of the Dog is that it's really, really great, and some aspects of its greatness are immediately apparent, like the performances of the four leads, Ari Wagner Cinematography, and Johnny Greenwood's score, all Oscar nominated. Other aspects of its greatness are not so immediately apparent, but trust me, they're there. I said in my Mank review last year that I'm not great about assessing a movie after one viewing, but this was a whole other level. First of all, just on a practical level, the ending completely flew over my head. I finished the movie and then pulled up the LA Times app so I could read Justin Chang's review, my go-to, and I instead pulled up an interview with one of the actors. And the very first question was, "Why did your character do X?" And I was like, wait, the character did that? Don't mind me, just casually missing the payoff of the entire movie. In the movie's defense, I actually think the ending is completely clear. As long as you're paying attention, you won't need an LA Times interview to explain things to you. In my defense, I was definitely paying attention. I just made the mistake of watching this for the first time over the course of 2 nights. And while the ending is a payoff to an earlier setup, I got the setup in night 1 and the payoff in night 2, and I didn't connect the dots. But the ending wasn't the only thing that improved on second watch. People have described The Power of the Dog as a slow burn. I've described it as a slow burn. But that's really only the case on first watch. On second watch, once you know the movie's secrets, it plays out more like a psychological thriller. Seriously, I'm not sure I can think of a movie whose perceived pacing was improved this much on subsequent viewings. It's crazy, actually. There are some things revealed in the back half. Some of them you'll see coming a mile away, some of them you will not see coming. And if you're me, you will watch the movie and still not understand what exactly unfolds until you read an LA Times interview that makes you question your sanity. The narrative dominoes hide in plain sight, and even the falling of the dominoes isn't obvious. At least it wasn't to me. What I want to do is prime you to enjoy the movie on your first viewing as much as I did on my second viewing. That might be difficult to do without revealing too many of the secrets in the back half of the movie, but I'll do my best. The movie is about 4 people living in Montana in 1925. 2 of the 4 are brothers who own a ranch, Phil Burbank, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, and George Burbank, played by Jesse Plemons. At the end of a cattle run, the Burbank brothers and their herding crew stay at an inn run by a woman named Rose, played by Kirsten Dunst. While having dinner there, Phil is exceptionally rude to the waiter, Rose's teenage son Peter, played by Cody Smith-McPhee. To be fair, Phil is also exceptionally rude to basically everyone, but his treatment of Peter especially upsets Rose. When George goes back the next day to apologize for his brother, he ends up hanging out for a while. He and Rose take to each other, and they quickly marry. That really upsets Phil. When George tells him they were married, Phil goes outside and beats a horse out of misplaced anger and frustration. You can read a few things into this reaction. The most immediate being that while Phil is definitely the rugged, self-reliant, outdoorsy type, he's definitely not a harmony with nature outdoorsy type, more the I'm a man and have dominion over all God's creatures outdoorsy type. Second, why does George's marriage to Rose upset Phil so much? To hear him tell it, it's because he thinks Rose is only marrying George for his money.
Well, Brother Phil?
I'm not your brother. You're a cheap schemer.
It's definitely not the main focus of the movie, but there definitely is a subtle economic undercurrent. Phil and George are relatively well off, having run this ranch for 25 years, and their parents ran it before them. And Rose is certainly marrying above her station. She begins the movie cooking for and waiting on guests at her inn, and then suddenly she has people cooking for her and waiting on her once she marries George. So money and gold digging is what Phil claims upsets him about Rose and George's marriage, but there are other unspoken but heavily implied reasons it bothers him. Number 1, jealousy. Rose brings George happiness in a way that eludes Phil for reasons that are not terribly hard to guess. You also get the sense that Phil and George have been growing apart for a while now. They're pretty different guys nowadays with pretty different dispositions, and presumably Phil knows that George marrying Rose will only worsen that disconnect. Coming back to the economic angle, there's something of a white-collar, blue-collar barrier between Phil and George. Phil being the rugged outdoorsman sporting chaps and dirt, and George being more the managerial type in bowlers and bow ties. Notably, when we're first introduced to the brothers, it's as they're having a conversation through a door, where George is in the house bath and Phil has just come in from outside and refuses a bath. We later learn Phil prefers to wash up outside in a secluded lake for reasons. But what's notable is that this blue-collar, white-collar dispositional barrier, for lack of a better phrase, is self-inflicted. Phil and George are not in different tax brackets. They co-own the ranch together. They're both wealthy. George dresses, socializes, and carries himself as a man with money, but Phil prefers to project this tough, self-reliant field hand aesthetic.
You're going to want to keep your distance and just off the horse.
In fact, we later learned Phil was a classics major at Yale, which doesn't exactly square with the guy he is now. Which brings up the question, why is Phil like this? What is he holding on to and why? While these are all interesting questions with simpler answers than you might expect, I'm bearing the lead here. Yes, Phil has some serious conflict with Rose, which leads to some implicit conflict with his brother George, but the crux of the movie is the tension between Phil and Rose's son, Peter. Over the opening credits, we hear a voiceover from Peter where he says, "When my father passed, I wanted nothing more than my mother's happiness. For what kind of man would I be if I did not help my mother, if I did not save her?" That's effectively the thesis statement of the movie, to the point that the final shots of the movie are basically payoff to that opening voiceover. But more explicitly, that voiceover tells you Peter's stake in the central conflict. Phil makes Peter's mother completely miserable, so Peter has beef with Phil. And Phil's beef with Peter is presumably centered on the performance and expression of masculinity.
Who's that?
Miss Nancy. You're going to see him creeping all over the place now.
Note that in that opening thesis statement, Peter evokes his own masculinity. What kind of man would I be if I did not help my mother? I've already talked about how Phil carries himself. Brash, domineering, self-reliant. He's always wearing chaps and spurs, and he's always covered in dirt. And he refuses the house bath and prefers to bathe in lakes. And he's always talking about going up into the mountains to camp and shoot elk and live off the land. But as I've also said, his brother George, who Phil was raised with and has worked beside for 25 years, isn't like this. We get hints that George was maybe more of a rugged outdoorsman years ago, but he's long since left it behind, and Phil has not. Or maybe Phil left it behind for a bit to go be a classics major at Yale, but he's since come back to it. In taking the totality of what we know about Phil and George, it's hard not to see Phil's traditionally masculine demeanor as a bit of a put-on, as a performance. Peter, on the other hand, is not traditionally masculine in any sense of the word. Not in the way he talks, or in the way he looks, or in the way he carries himself, or in his interests. Notably, when we first meet Peter, he's doing arts and crafts, cutting and folding paper into roses. And it's actually these paper roses that inspire Phil's first cruel taunt of Peter when they first meet.
I wonder what little lady made these.
Actually, I did, sir.
Oh, well, do pardon me.
Why Phil performs such hardline traditional masculinity, and why he takes issue with Peter's non-traditional expression of masculinity, we eventually learn, but the answer's not hard to see coming. I was listening to Benedict Cumberbatch on Mark Maron's podcast, and he said something really smart about Peter's character, and that is, Peter's arc is in our perception of him. Peter doesn't really change through the course of the movie, but how we see him changes. I'll admit that at the start of the movie, I heard how Peter talks and saw how he walks and how he dresses, and I judged Peter. I judged him in the same way that Phil does. I thought, this poor kid, he's probably got a tough life ahead of him, because you immediately assume he's soft. And 1925 Montana was not kind to soft young men. But throughout the movie, you learn that Peter is confident, cunning, and extremely capable, and he has no issues navigating the world around him. Last thing I'll say about the story, Phil observes Rose in what she thinks is a private moment. And then a few scenes later, Peter observes Phil in what he thinks is a private moment. These end up being two pretty important scenes in the plot. The reactions from all parties involved is telling, and these moments highlight the performance aspect of the movie, the disconnect between how we're forced to act in polite society versus how we act alone. So I said at the top that the movie is great in some apparent ways and in some not so apparent ways. And what I'm hoping will happen is that all the talk so far about the characters and conflicts between them will help prime you and clue you into what to look for, whether it's your first watch or a rewatch, so you might appreciate the movie's not so apparent greatness. But what about the stuff in the movie that doesn't need much explanation? Ari Wagner Cinematography, for instance. It's just dazzling, wildly beautiful stuff. Ari Wagner is just the second woman ever nominated for Best Cinematography, after Rachel Morrison for Mudbound, and she could win. Current betting odds have her just a hair behind Greg Fraser for Dune, but that's a pretty stacked category that really anybody could win. Speaking of which, did you guys see Macbeth? Holy shit. This is probably the most famous single shot in any Western. It's the final shot of The Searchers. Spoilers for a 66-year-old movie. It famously frames John Wayne's Ethan Edwards just outside of a doorway, with the door being a physical and metaphorical barrier between civilization and the outlaw West. Ethan is on one side, we are on the other. Phil Burbank is introduced in a similarly framed fashion, and it's hard not to think about ways that Phil belongs on that side of the barrier. He doesn't really get along with anyone because he's such a mean son of a bitch, so he shuns society, but he is also shunned by society in certain ways. One of my favorite bits of cinematography is a scene where Rose is anxiously practicing piano because she may have to play for a high society dinner party later on. And elsewhere in the house, Phil loudly and expertly plays banjo in order to taunt Rose over her rudimentary piano playing. And there's a shot that slowly pushes in on Rose playing piano, and then it stops pushing in as she stops playing to listen to the faint sounds of a banjo from upstairs. And then it continues pushing in as Rose continues playing, and then stops again when she again stops to listen. It's shot like a horror movie, like Rose is a victim who is slowly realizing the killer's in the house. It's good shit, and really puts into Rose's anxious mindset and explains the dynamic between Rose and Phil. Then there's our guy, Johnny Greenwood. Roll clip from 4 years ago.
Greenwood's score here is not only worthy of the Oscar, it's worthy of your vinyl collection and also of Carnegie Hall.
This is Johnny Greenwood's second Oscar nomination after Phantom Thread. And for a good while, I was convinced he'd be double nominated this year for Power of the Dog and Spencer, or maybe even for Power of the Dog and Licorice Pizza. But alas, just the one. He's probably going to lose to Hans Zimmer for Dune, but we'll see. Greenwood claims he doesn't write bits of music specifically for characters and prefers to write to fit situations or to the tone of the scene. But it definitely worked out, accidentally or otherwise, that characters seem to have certain musical themes. Rose has this detuned piano theme, which fits because she plays piano. Similarly, Phil plays banjo many times throughout the movie, but Greenwood said that a banjo score didn't sound right, so he instead finger-picked a cello as if it were a banjo, and that's how he got the propulsive rhythmic sound. Johnny Greenwood's first movie score was for There Will Be Blood, another Western set in the first quarter of the 1900s. But his Power of the Dog score is pretty distinct from that. It kind of reminds me a bit of Nick Cave and Warren Ellis' score for the assassination of Jesse James, but for his part, Greenwood says he didn't want to do a traditional Western score for this, which typically have like sweeping strings and that sort of thing. Instead, Greenwood turned to things like Star Trek for inspiration, because Peter venturing out into the wilderness on a horse, for instance, felt like he was going into an alien, forbidding landscape. So Greenwood used atonal brass to capture that. Greenwood's score definitely ups the tension. It gives the movie an undercurrent of dread and menace, which brings me back to something I said earlier, which is that on first watch the movie is a bit of a slow burn, but on second watch it plays more like a thriller. A lot of that's in the performances. Like, once you have a grasp on the dynamics between the characters, every line and look feels more loaded, but I mostly have to chalk it up to the deliberateness of the storytelling. Writer-director Jane Campion is extremely precise with how the narrative unfolds. What the audience knows, what we don't know, what we learn and when, and how, etc. It's extremely impressive, and it really works. Jane Campion was the second woman ever nominated for Best Director for The Piano, and now she's the first woman to be nominated for Best Director twice. She already has an Oscar for The Piano screenplay, and maybe the hardware is getting a little dusty after 28 years, but she's going to add to it this year. She's an effective lock to be the third woman to win Best Director. She's the current odds-on favorite to win Adapted Screenplay, and the movie is the current odds-on favorite to win Best Picture, which could net her a third Oscar of the night as producer. All deserved, especially Adapted Screenplay, and it's hard to argue against her case for director. But Campion is bringing more than just wildly impressive precision in the storytelling. She's bringing perspective. For a Best Picture frontrunner, The Power of the Dog didn't really generate that much ink or inspire that much conversation. But that changed earlier this month when Sam Elliott went on Mark Maron's podcast and had some thoughts. He took issue with a few things in the movie, not the least of which being Jane Campion's perspective on the American West as a woman from New Zealand, where they shot the movie, by the way.
But what the fuck does this woman from down there
New Zealand.
New Zealand
Right.
know about the American West. And why in the fuck does she shoot this movie in New Zealand and call it Montana?
It's good. This movie.
And say, this is the way it was.
This got you, this movie.
So that fucking rubbed me the wrong way, pal.
You have to use so many cuss words.
So yeah, that generated some ink. First of all, even if Jane Campion knew nothing about the American West, Thomas Savage, who wrote the novel upon which the movie is based, certainly did. Second of all, if you stop and think about some of the things that defined the American West, both historically and in popular culture, you might find more overlap with New Zealand than you might initially expect. Violent displacement of native people, for instance. Third of all, I think it's kind of funny that Sam Elliott's complaint about the movie is actually one of the things I find most interesting about the movie. Jane Campion's supposed outsider perspective. In many ways, the movie is interrogating the function of hypermasculinity, why someone would act this way. And having this done in an Old West setting is implicitly interrogating modern American masculinity by extension, asking why we were the way we were in order to discover why we are the way we are. That kind of thing. Sam Elliott may take issue with a non-American woman making a movie about American masculinity, but for a topic that's so pervasive, the myths of the American West and the cowboy arguably being the bedrock from which all American storytelling and popular culture grew out of, I think the perspective of someone who grew up less in the shadow of that, giving her take on it, is definitely welcome and worthwhile. And her perspective has made for a really, really great movie.